Hi friends, welcome back to the studio. Today is July 1st, so that means if I've been keeping up with my 2024 cottage temperature quilt, I should just about be done with my first 2 rows. Today I want to talk to you about the tree. So you can see over here I have my tree done for my March block this year, but directly behind me I have May, and May has a 31st day, which means I have a tree that has to go in between the May and the June block. So today I thought I'd walk you through the tree. In addition to that, I also wanted to talk to you about fabrics, because as we know from the start of this quilt, I was doing this entire thing from my stash of fabrics. And I want to talk to you about the challenges that can pose, ways that I have had to accommodate for that, for using just the fabrics that I had on hand, and also a couple little spots when you go to put these rows together that might trip you up as they did me. So stick around, let's make a tree together. Hey, I'm glad you're here. So let's make this tree. Let's look overhead at what the pattern says in making the tree. Here's our pattern. You can see this is all of the blocks together as we're going to assemble them. So let me go back a little bit. We'll find the tree and we'll look at what the tree takes to put together. All right, here we go on page 8 of our pattern, and you can see here I have the tree block. There it is right there. So what the pattern calls for to start with the tree is this big square. Now this is where some of the challenges of using fat quarters for your fabrics are going to come in, because most of those fabrics we're going to cut into our 3-inch squares for this pattern, but we don't know what the final 31st day in the month is actually going to be. We don't know what the temperature is going to be. So in the pattern, the instructions say that you want to cut as you go, and that is absolutely 100% correct. Because this is a temperature quilt, and we don't know what temperature it's going to be from day to day, week to week, month to month, we're never going to know what color fabric we're actually going to use for each one of those blocks. And the challenge with the tree is that the body of the tree, as you can see here, is also made from a color. So whatever that temperature is for the day, we have to have a block that size. Now our pattern shows us that we're going to be working with that big block. It's block number M, and that's going to be a 5-inch square. So that's what I have here, a 5-inch square, because that's the color it was on the last day of May this year. So I'm starting with a 5-inch square. Now you can see where the challenge would be. If you took your fat quarter for this color and you just cut it up into a bunch of 3-inch strips, you would not have enough fabric to cut this great big square. So occasionally we're going to run into that, and you might have to substitute some colors in the same kind of vein. But I didn't do that. I did what the pattern suggested. I cut as I went. I actually wound up cutting a couple of strips off of each color as I used them, and left a larger hunk just in case for whatever reason I needed this big square. And then of course, if you cut a big strip for the square, you can always subcut that strip into the strips you need to finish the blocks within the cottage temperature quilt. So the first step in making our tree block here, you can see, is we start with our big square. And then we're going to make what is essentially a snowball block. So the snowball block requires that we put 4 little squares of background right in each corner. And the pattern indicates that we want to put one in the opposite corner. Now I want to just touch on that for a second, because we are going to put them in the opposite corner and sew them. The reason the pattern does that is on occasion when your corner squares are big enough in your block, they might overlap. You always want to do opposing corners and then opposing corners. If those 2 squares actually overlap in the center, you're not going to be able to sew them all at the same time, and you want all the seams to look the same. So that's, I believe, why they designed the pattern to put in each corner. But because these little squares that we're going to use are 1 inch, and here they are, my little 1-inch background squares, because they're small, we're never going to overlap them. So you really don't need to worry about doing them in opposing corners. You can put them all down on the same time. So what we're going to do is we're going to put each of these little squares into a corner, and then we're going to draw a diagonal line from point to point, and that's going to become our sewing line for this block. So here we go. I've put them all in the corners. And you want your sewing line to cut off the corner of the square so that you always know you're going to sew from this corner to this corner, never from this corner to this corner. So you can see I have all my little lines going in the outside corner. So what I'm going to do is take this to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew all the way down right there, corner to corner, and open it up and press. So let's go do that. So as you can see, I've gone ahead and done that. I have sewn diagonally and pressed those triangles up into this. Now we have our little snowball block. Now, to reduce bulk, we can go in on the back of our block and just take our rotary cutter and trim out 1/4 inch. You can measure that if you need to, but trim out the 1/4 inch, and that'll help reduce bulk in the back side of that block. Let's do that. Okay, and now we have our snowball block. So you can see here, I'm already building the block. Here's the top of the block. This is block part A, and I've got my part A fabric here. And then we have our M, and we're going to attach G to the sides. So now we have our snowball block and our sky, so you can already see our tree coming together. So now it's time to put in our trunk. Our trunk is made up of, as you can see down here, our piece measured F. There it is, there's our trunk. And then on either side of F, we have some background. There's our background piece. And then on each side, there it is right there, on each side of the background piece, we're going to put another little square of trunk material. And you can see on this side, we're going to put just on the inside here, just on one corner, we're going to put one square and sew diagonally. And then on this side, we're going to put another square into the inside and sew diagonally. And then when we put our fold back together here, that's what makes the base of our tree. Let's press that and make that base. All right, now we have put together the base of our fabric by doing our little squares in the corner of our parts. We cut out and trimmed the back and pressed them really nicely, and we sewed the left one to the center and the right one to the center and pressed. So there are our 3 parts of our tree. So all we need to do now is just go and put the 3 parts together and we'll have our tree block. Okay, gang, our tree block is done. We can put it up here right up next to May, ready to go in the row. Now that brings me to my next thing that I really wanted to talk about here about this quilt. I had some assembly issues, and I really want to go back to the pattern here so I can show you exactly what the problem was. Now, when I say problem, I don't mean with the pattern. The problem is solely lies with me, and I'll tell you why. I think it's very difficult for pattern designers to read patterns because we are always making assumptions about what the pattern designer is going to do next. And I think this also exists with people who have had lots of experience sewing. We read a part of a pattern, you're supposed to read the pattern all the way through, and we're supposed to look at each individual thing and follow the instructions, which in this pattern are very clear and very precise. And I did not do that. So I ran into a couple of issues, and I just kind of wanted to point them out for you. Let's look at the rows. So if you look here, turn my eraser around so I don't draw on my block. I have my January block and then my tree, and you'll see here I have these little strips in between. So I actually assembled this quilt, not even thinking about it. I got really excited. I finished a block. I went and sewed the tree together and realized there's a space in between the house and the tree. I really needed to put that strip in there. It's a 1.5 inch strip, and I went back and took it apart and did some unsewing and put my strip in there, and I put another strip in there. Now, because I was working with Stash Fabrics, you know that I picked this white tone-on-tone here to do all of my squares. And I knew that I was gonna be low or tight on that type of fabric. I can always add another tone-on-tone, so I wasn't concerned. But I did wanna preserve that fabric as much as possible. If I could do all the blocks out of the same fabric, great. If I can't, that's okay, but it would be nice. So I was a little bit hesitant to use any other kind of fabric when it came to doing the rest of the background. But I did anyway, and I chose this sort of, it's kind of a whitish gray, kind of marbly type fabric. When I did the roofs, and I cut all the roofs, I did use that part as my background fabric, which is slightly darker than the white, but not a problem for me at all. So I chose that fabric. Now when I picked that fabric, I also knew I didn't have a lot of it. So when it came time to put these lovely little strips in here, it took a lot of yardage that I wasn't expecting to use. And so I was a little bit concerned because I already pre-cut all of the blocks for the tree and all of that. So I didn't really need extra 1.5 inch things. If I had thought about it and read through the pattern, I would have cut these strips, and everything that was left over I would have used to make these squares. It didn't happen that way because I really wasn't paying that much attention. Again, didn't read the pattern. So this is a cautionary tale for you. You should read through that pattern. So now I've gone ahead and I've put those little strips in between my trees, and then I did it again in between this block. And okay, so now I know eventually I could run out of that background fabric. So I have to think about that in the back of my mind. Now let's go to the second row. I finished the first row and I made my April block and I made my May block, and I got really excited. And in between those blocks, I sewed this cute little 1.5 inch strip, because that's what we did up here in between all the blocks, right? We did this 1.5 inch strip, except let's look at the pattern. If you notice here in the pattern, this first row is exactly how I have it on the wall. But then when you go to the second row, well, this strip was an H strip and this strip is an I strip, and it is clearly wider than the rest of the strips. That is why the one I'm showing you here has obvious seams down the side, because I had to rip it out. So now let's look at the pattern again, right? We'll look at the one that's on the wall. It makes total sense, right? In this row, I have 3 houses and 2 trees. In the second row, well, April didn't have a tree and June doesn't have a tree, which means I would have 3 houses and 1 tree. The math doesn't add up. So they had to go back and add a slightly wider piece. Well, now let's go back to our background. I knew I wasn't maybe gonna have enough background to get all those little strips down. So I didn't even take a chance of waiting until I got to the end to change fabrics. So I went through my stash and I found 2 more fabrics. Now these fabrics, let's give you a little look at them right here. Again, they are reeds as solids. They are not solids, just like all the rest of my fabrics are not solids. And let's look at them up against this other fabric. Well, they're not the same, but they're really not bothering me. They're not that much different. They're maybe a shade hair darker than the rest of the background. So, and there's not a lot of it on the stash bolts. So again, we're making this out of stash. So we're kind of winging it as we go. So rather than getting really stressed out, oh gosh, you know, I have one fabric here and another fabric here and another fabric here, it's okay. And what I can do now is, knowing that I've had to mix up fabrics, I can now intentionally mix up fabrics. So I've already started with my wide strips here, mixing in, and I have another one, which is gonna go on the other side of the tree. So when I build my quilt and I add my June block, I'm gonna need another wide strip here. So you can start to see I've already changed tones a little bit. So now I can leave that in there and hope for the best and hope those 2 fabrics are gonna get me to the end, or I can swap on the 3rd row and add in a 3rd fabric just out of the blue. Now, why would I do that versus, well, okay. If you start with one fabric and you run out, and let's say you only run out by a little bit, it kind of stands out like a sore thumb, right? Because everything's the same except this one little piece. And chances are nobody would notice it except me, but it might bother me a little bit. But if I mix the fabrics up, it's not gonna bother me at all. So I've started with this fabric. I know all my roofs are gonna be the same, and I know all my trees are gonna be the same, except maybe this part up here. So I've introduced a 2nd fabric in the border here. I can introduce a 3rd fabric above the tree and in the sky and in the strips. And then I can kind of piece it all together, and it will look a little bit more intentional since I'm only halfway through. And I think that's a good idea. So starting out in the next row, now that I'm starting with July, when I start working on the tree block in July and all this striping in here, I'm probably gonna introduce a 3rd fabric just so it looks a little bit more intentional, okay? Now, I don't mind running out of these fabrics. I just don't want to run out at the end. So I'm going to intentionally mix them up because there isn't a lot of fabric here. And I really haven't gotten to the rows in the middle. Because remember I said I was going to do, when I go to add the 2 rows in the middle, I'm probably going to do something different than the pattern. So I have to think about that too. That I'm going to be adding things and changing things, and maybe I'm going to make some different blocks and I'm going to add a different background. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce that now while I have the opportunity to do so, and then hopefully it'll look a little bit more intentional. And then, you know what, if I get to the point where I'm doing a border and I need to introduce a 4th fabric, well, it won't matter so much. I won't fret about it at all. I'll just introduce another fabric. So that's just a little trick that I do to make sure that I don't feel at all nervous about using different fabrics, or they're not going to blend right, or, you know, any of that kind of thing. I just sort of look ahead and start thinking about, okay, this is a possibility, so what's my contingency plan? And then I make a plan, and then I go, we're nearing that time when I need to start making a decision about what to do. Now that's going to happen again with the next block, and I'll kind of show you why. I haven't quite finished with June, almost, but I'll show you. Hey quilters, let me let you in on a little secret. I really enjoy making these videos for you, and I really hope you like them too. If you do like them, hit the thumbs up, and if you want more, definitely hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you're notified when we put out new content. And thanks so much. Now back to the real stuff. Okay, let me show you where I am in June. So here you go, here's April and its divider, and May and its divider, and I think, let me make sure, nope, it's a thick. Okay, so I have a thick piece here, and then I have another one that's gonna go on the outside of the June block. So it'll go on this far side over here. So I've set that one aside. Now, what's gonna happen with the color? Now remember, each one of my colors I only had a fat quarter of, and I got it completely out of my stash. The chances of me having 2 fat quarters the same are probably pretty slim, but that's okay because again, we can use the same tone or something similar to fill in. So let's see what's happening here. Now here in North Carolina, we have had, well, we've had a drought and we've had some pretty heavy temperatures for the last few months. So if you look over here, let's go this way. I have this little pink color here, and I have it appearing 3 times in my April block. That temperature span is between 86 and 90 degrees, which means 3 times in April, the temperature spiked to somewhere between 86 and 90. Now look at May. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 times in May, it spiked. So if you think about how many 3-inch squares you can get from a fat quarter, which is how many I need 1 3-inch square again to make 2 of these blocks, right? It's gonna get pretty tight because let's look over here at June. I'm missing 3 colors here, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 days. And I'm probably gonna get, with the record temperatures that we're having in the 90s, I'm probably gonna have the same problem with my 95 to 100 degree weather. So it's pretty crazy. This guy right here, this big dark red one right here, that was 102 degrees. We had a 102 really last week. So, and it's been pretty much 99 degrees ever since. So I'm gonna be using a lot of red here. So we're only in, this is only the June block, and we've just popped into July. We have July, August, and September to get through, and I still only have 1 fat quarter of this color. So again, thinking ahead with my contingency plan, I'm already looking in my stash for something around this color. If I have a second one, great, but if I don't, something that fits into this shade. And it's a very specific shade so that I know that I can substitute that color and I'll still get the same look to my temperature quilt that I was looking for. This quilt is already getting really, really warm, and I'm not gonna have as many cool colors. So that's another thing. How do I balance this quilt? Because I don't know what temperature it's gonna be. I'm just kind of going with the flow here. It's our first full year here in North Carolina, and I really didn't pay that much attention to what those temperatures are gonna be. Had I thought about it, I probably would have changed the scale a little bit so that I could introduce more cool colors, but that's okay because Again, I'm gonna do something fun in the rows between these houses and also in the border. So I have to think again, if my quilt's gonna be really, really warm, I'm probably gonna wanna introduce some of those cooler colors that I'm either not gonna use or not gonna get to when I start adding in the other elements of my quilt. Like maybe I'll do another tree, and if I do, I'll probably introduce some green so I can introduce a little bit more cool into this particular design. So you can add and remove fabrics as you want, but if you're running out of fabric, and this might happen to you if you bought the kit, let's say you bought that fat quarter kit of solids and you're also living in North Carolina and you're having the same problem I'm having right now. Don't worry about scrambling around to have exactly the right amount of fabric, because if you do that, you're going to wind up maybe over buying fabric you don't really need. And I don't want you to stress over it because it's really fun. So the last little thing that I wanted to tell you is, remember I told you it's really easy to get caught up on this quilt, and you can start at any time and you can finish at any time. But I know people are probably feeling like there's a lot of half square triangles and a lot of little pieces to get started. It's already half of the year is over, and I don't know is how I want to start now on a project I'm never going to finish because I'm never going to get caught up. Well, first off, take never out of your vocabulary, because that is not a given, all right? I can tell you the only way that you'll never catch up is if you never start. So that's it right there. So I had a pretty intensive filming schedule in the month of May, and I wasn't able to keep up as much with my blocks. So a girlfriend of mine came over last week. She had something she was working on here in the studio that she needed my help with, and I thought, you know, now's a good time since I'm up here to get caught up on this block. I had probably 3 pieces left in the month of May, and I had the entire month of June to get through. And you know what? It really didn't take any time at all. I marked down my temperatures on the sheet. I sat down, I pulled out as many squares as I needed, and to be frankly honest, even with helping her and doing everything that I needed to do for this quilt, including cutting new strips of colors I didn't have cut and new squares, between all of the cutting and all of the sewing and all of the pressing and trimming and all of that, it literally took me an hour to get caught up, to do an entire month. So get started. If this is something you really want to do, go ahead and grab your fabrics and get started cutting, and then just start doing several blocks, you know, a week, and you'll get caught up in no time. It's really quite an easy quilt to get caught up on. So do not fret it at all. It's no problem. And if you're really, really stressed over it, you can start it next year. But I'm telling you, it's really easy. So again, you're never going to get caught up if you never start. So let's get started. And I hope that if you have started it and you're sewing with me, that you're finding the tips really helpful, and knowing that a designer also kind of doesn't read the pattern and has to unsew. It's probably done more unsewing on this quilt than I've done it unsewing in probably the last year, because I didn't pay attention. So I like to tell you when I make those cautionary tales and let you know so that prevent you from doing the same thing. So hopefully you enjoyed it. If you have, like and subscribe, and you know, until next time, have fun making your temperature quilt. Happy quilting.